Good evening and welcome to Crossroads. The COVID-19 so-called pandemic, well, it revealed a lot of things that were happening in our country that a lot of us didn't know about. The power and size of the unelected administrative state, the willingness of big tech to censor even the sitting president of the United States, and the mainstream media's ability to push a narrative to the point where citizens will literally lock themselves down. But the revelation that hit closest to home for a lot of people, well, that was what was happening in our education system. Parents who had their kids at home being educated remotely, well, they saw exactly what the kids were being taught. And many were shocked. There had been this talk of critical race theory, CRT, woke gender ideology, hyperliberalism, being taught in the system before the pandemic. But many people thought that this was something just happening in the colleges. We thought it was happening in the universities and the more liberal cities at that. What the pandemic revealed, though, was that it was happening everywhere and at every single age level. There's been a lot of pushback to this indoctrination of our children from parents' rights groups and at school board meetings. We've heard some about this. But CRT still has not gone away. Now, as the Federalist reported, the new K-12 social studies standards being approved right now in Minnesota, for example, it shows that CRT is still being pushed by woke educators, but under different guises, and that goes back to kindergarten. Minnesota is looking to adopt an ethnic study course to its core curriculum, and you can see it here in the Department of Education's proposed permanent rules relating to K-12 academic standards in social studies from September of this year. Ethnic studies, well, it doesn't sound too bad, right? But if you take a closer look at the details of this program, you're going to see why it's concerning. One standard within this ethnic studies is resistance. And it basically teaches kids to look at things through the lens of America as being systemic and coordinated exercise of power, centering on those that have been marginalized, erased, or ignored. And it tells students to organize with others to engage in activities that could further the rights and dignity of all. Wow, sounds a little activist to me. Here are a few more examples from the commissioner-approved draft of the proposed standards that was released earlier that exemplify the different ideologies that our children are being exposed to. This is what's going to be taught to ninth graders if they do this. Quote, design an action plan to address the disproportionate impacts of environmental issues and climate change on different communities from local to national scales. Well, sounds like environmentalism to me, and that's usually a lot less about the actual environment and a whole lot more about pushing a political agenda using the environment. This is for fifth graders. Analyze anti-colonial and anti-racist resistance movements of culturally, racially, and ethnically diverse people throughout the world. It sounds a whole lot like the anti-racism language, for example, of Ibram X. Kendi. And that's a system of racism disguised as anti-racism. And as a side note, what is the difference between people that are racially diverse and ethnically diverse? Anyone? I don't know either. Last I checked, every single person is part of an ethnicity and every person is racial. Doesn't matter what race that is. And here's what they want to teach sixth graders, by the way. They want them to, quote, examine the impact of slavery and race in Minnesota today. And that's interesting because, well, slavery has been abolished in Minnesota since Minnesota was a thing. In fact, since it became a state, there has never been legal slavery in Minnesota since it gained statehood in 1858. Pre-Civil War, by the way. But look, I'm sure it's very important for students from the impact of it in a state that never had it. And there are many, many more examples in these guidelines that typify the ideology of modern educators. And it's not limited to Minnesota either, by the way. Take Virginia as an example. Elementary school students were asked to role play as slaves and landowners. This sort of thing is what the new generation of teachers are educating our kids with. And no matter how much pushback parents give to this stuff, well, they still push it. And they do it in this way where they give it a nice sounding name, something other than CRT, by the way, to sneak it in through the back door. And why, you might be asking, why is it so crucial for them to teach kids in viewing the world this way, in terms of race, gender, identity, power, class, and wealth? Well, we've seen numerous examples recently of teachers who are self-proclaimed non-binary or queer or trans or openly bragging about all these things on social media, including in how they're indoctrinating their students.
My major problem with school. I really don't do anything unless I actually want to do it. And most of the time, I don't want to do anything at all.
So, where is all this coming from? Why do we seem to suddenly have an epidemic of wokeness throughout our entire public school system? Well, the answer goes back a little bit in history, back to the founders of modern education. That's men like John Dewey, the quote-unquote father of modern education. Organizations like the Frankfurt School, which in turn have impacted the education program at Columbia University, which notably contains a teachers' college, and to influence really from the policies of progressive President Woodrow Wilson and others. To simplify a very long history, the educational system in the United States was changed from within. The men that had the biggest impact on modern public education, they had an ideology that was a predecessor to everything we are seeing today. And they were heavily influenced by Marxism, modernism, pragmatism, and the so-called Enlightenment. They were really pushed what was largely private, religious, and classical education systems in the U.S. towards being state-run, secular, and deeply modern. We don't have to look any further than the statements of John Dewey, the father of modern public education, who said this: "If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow." Simply put, the public education system was changed into a system where children were no longer taught how to think. Instead, they're being taught what to think. And that is part of why we see teachers today pushing ideology, because it is what the people behind the modern education system envisioned from the very beginning. Have we ever thought about this question? Why is the government in charge of education at all? Well, the answer is because the men that pushed education to where it is now, they did not believe that it should be private or religious at all. When philosophies like Marxism, existentialism, and critical race theory are in the origins, well, look, it's no wonder the fruit of that system is the way we're seeing it today. Well, folks, it's all for YouTube. For the rest of the episode, come join us on Epoch TV. We'll be talking about the CCP's interest in the Hamas-Israel war and actually what they're doing globally with this, and some different ways of viewing what's happening, and also some of the traps the U.S. risks falling into. We'll also be talking about Biden wanting $105 billion for Ukraine, Israel, and a few other things, and also whether that's going to be put to good use or not, what that actually means in practice, and again, whether there's a real clear path to victory for the U.S., let's say. All that and more. And again, we also have a lot of great shows, documentaries, and of course, my show as well on Epoch TV. So come join us there. You help us keep doing what we're doing, keep making great content, and I appreciate your support. I'll see you on Epoch TV.